So today we are celebrating Robert Louis Stevenson's birthday, 13th of November, 1850.
Yes. So you might know him for Treasure Island, Kidnap, those kind of adventure stories, but also my favourite one, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Very gothic, and probably, I think, the best example we've got of the gothic double in Victorian literature, which I love. So if you watched last month's podcast or listened to last month's podcast, then you heard us talking about dream and what the Victorians thought dreams were, and kind of in this early development of psychology. And actually the idea of double and dream are also really closely connected. So kind of coming back to dreams a little bit. So the idea for The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I don't know whether you know this already, but it supposedly came to Robert Louis Stevenson in a dream.
Oh, that varies. As I whispered into the mic last episode, Inception.
Yeah, yeah. So it just seems very fitting. So he wrote a chapter on dreams in 1888, and he kind of explains where the idea for this came from. And he says that he had this dream, and it's quite. We won't get too far into it, but it's quite strange. He kind of he attributes it to these like brownies who kind of like give the idea to him.
And we know what brownies are from Jackie's episode.
We do.
On fairies in Jane Eyre.
So if you're not sure about brownies, highly recommend.
Yeah, go back to our April episode.
Yeah, Jackie explains it very nicely. So it's this like fantastical dream where he gets the idea for Jekyll and Hyde. If you're listening to this and you don't really know the story of Jekyll and Hyde, the basis of this is you've got a man who drinks this, I hesitate to say potion, but essentially it's a potion. He drinks this kind of chemical concoction that allows him to divide himself into Dr. Jekyll, which is basically the person he was before, mainly, and also Mr. Hyde. So as Mr. Hyde, he is the other side of himself. He's
hidden. Hyde.
Yeah, exactly. The bit that he wouldn't have let the world see, but because it's Mr. Hyde doing it and not Jekyll, it's kind of okay. He can let Mr. Hyde do the things that he can't normally do in society. So this all comes back to the idea of the double brain, which is actually its origins are from a much, much older time. So René Descartes in 1649, he wrote Passions of the Soul, which I don't know if you're familiar with.
No, tell me about it.
So in Passions of the Soul, he kind of tries to explain that the soul can be found in the pineal gland.
Where would that be?
So this is, in our last episode, we talked about the physiological explanations for dreams and how kind of at their most extreme that would be like you can find the origin of everything that happens in your body. If you dissected it, it will be there somewhere. So part of this like proving the existence of the soul was, where is it? If we've got it, then physically it should be in us somewhere. And Descartes argues that it's in the pineal gland, which is all to do with the brain again.
Sorry, I just had a really weird Victorian Mr. Hyde intrusive thought of like finding what it is and just having tons and tons of like bottled souls.
Oh no. That'd be a great gothic story actually.
I'm totally telling on myself.
Maybe we've read a little bit too much gothic.
Too much. And this particular text got me early because I was in the middle of nowhere in Scotland and I happened to find a bookshop and I can't remember where I was. I was like, it was raining, it was dreek, it was on like the edge of this massive lake, and I went into this bookshop and I found like a copy of they have like the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and other stories, like Penguin edition, or like no, it's the Oxford edition, like the red and white one. Yeah, so it must have been like 13, 14. I was just like, oh, that was a very gothic-y situation.
Yeah, that seems like the perfect, appropriate moment to pick up Jekyll and Hyde. So from that kind of really early, this is the physiological kind of sections of your brain where things happen. Then coming into the Victorians, it's not quite as extreme as that, so we don't have like this is the seat of your soul so much anymore. But now we've got this much more distinct kind of, there are two halves of your brain and this is what they do. So some people call this double brain, some people called it the dual brain. In some senses, they were kind of right.
Okay.
So you do see experiments. You can see these in the popular periodicals as well as in science. So
you want to talk to me about the pigeons?
Oh yeah, I forgot I showed you the pigeons. Okay, we won't put this up on the video, but in the Cornhill magazine, which is a general periodical edited by Thackeray, there is they had a lot of pictures, and so there's a woodcut of an experiment that they performed on pigeons where they took out the left side of the brain to see what would happen to it, and then took out the right side of the brain to see what would happen to it. So there were experiments like that, and it was, as I said, to some extent they kind of were right, because obviously looking at what happens to an animal if you remove one side of its brain, it did live. It doesn't die if it's only got one side, which is an important part of this theory, because technically with double brain you can only have one side, and that's fine. It's just that both sides do different things.
Which side am I meant to keep?
But it kind of depends what you want. So
Okay.
for a lot of these arguments, it's about like a masculine or feminine side of your brain.
Okay.
Now you can imagine where I'm going with this. What goes on the masculine side, what goes on the feminine side. So masculine side is the left side, I think, and that's supposed to be like logic, whereas the right side is the feminine side, and that's more like your emotions.
Okay.
They weren't quite as
cut and dry as that.
Yeah. I mean, it was for them, but but
in
again,
reality,
some things were kind of right. So now obviously we know if you damage one section of your brain, you might lose the ability to speak, for example, but not certain other capabilities. So kind of is segmented, but just not in this way. So one of the other kind of conclusions, I guess, from that was that if you're studying the criminal mind, people started to say that, well, maybe criminals become criminals because it's imbalanced between the left side and the right side. So they did an experiment with a woman who was a murderer.
Is this another excuse to just be like your feminine brain, all of those emotions overwhelming your logic?
Yeah, exactly.
Great.
So if you get an imbalance, if you exercise one side of your brain more than the other and it becomes unbalanced, then maybe you do something irrational, like commit a murder. And there were some people who claimed to have experimented on prisoners who'd done terrible crimes and said that they could prove this. Actually, the right side of their brain was enlarged.
Was that taken particularly seriously by like the criminal justice system? Because I can imagine if it was something that was believed, and I don't know, say a woman and a man who had committed similarly terrible crimes came to you, and they both argued that the feminine part of their brain was overexercised, overexerted, it might be easier to just be like, to look at the woman and just go, oh yes, you poor hysterical thing.
Yeah, it's not your fault.
Yeah. Whereas it potentially either might be difficult, or on the flip side, if you won that argument, to some extent knowing the gender situation of Victorian norms, difficult if you were a man to sort of say it was the feminine side of my brain, and either someone would just go, no, don't be ridiculous, you're just a terrible person who's done terrible things, or they'll just be like, oh, you can barely call yourself a man because you have a feminine brain.
Yeah, but I mean, like as you're kind of getting out there, it is complicated, and it depended. Some people really went in for this, and so it was kind of seen as a potential cure for insanity, for example. So if you said this person, they murdered someone, but they did it because they were insane, they had limited responsibility for that, and you could say, well, look, we can prove that one side of their brain was enlarged and therefore that's what made them do it, can you really blame them? Well, yeah. So
I'm scared. What do I do?
There is. Well, yeah, it wouldn't be the easiest thing to prove, but also it gives that kind of physiological reasoning behind something that otherwise they were kind of struggling to prove, to rationalise. And, you know, not everything's always rational, but we know the Victorians like to rationalise.
They like to understand things. There are people with a drive to, all people were people with a drive to understand things, but Victorians usually quite well known for it.
Making a lot of attempts on this. So, yeah.
I don't like the way you said attempts. I don't like it. I'm scared.
But yeah, I mean, that is also, again, if you were listening to last month's episode, I know that we talked about the connection between dream and insanity, and how, because of the way that the Victorians thought about dreams and what caused them and what they were, dream as a state was considered to be basically the same as insanity as a state. And so you get all of these kind of very subtle crossovers. Now, one of the other things that complicates it is, to what extent is that your fault? So, like I said, if you have one side of your brain enlarged, then that's going to lead you more to one side than the other. Mm-hmm. But is that part of your brain enlarged because it was naturally that way, or because you exercised that part of your brain too much?
Okay, I have to ask, is this linked to like forms of personal... Is this linked to like forms of personal responsibility, particularly around substances? So like if you drank a lot, for example, would they be like, oh, you have actively enlarged that part of your brain, therefore it is your fault that it is enlarged, therefore even if technically it was enlarged and might be seen as not your fault, it is your fault because you caused it to do that?
Yeah, so this is something that we actually see in Jekyll and Hyde, because where you've got Dr. Jekyll, he's the professional, and he's just, you know, he's socially normal, quote unquote.
And like, how normal are you if you're...
Yeah. So, but he wants to let out the other side of him. And at the beginning, you've got this combination. He is both Jekyll and Hyde, essentially. But when he creates this chemical formula that divides his two selves into kind of like literally physical selves, then Hyde can go off and do things without being interfered with by Jekyll, the other side of the brain. And the more he does that, the more Hyde, the right side of the brain, gets exercised, the more control it starts to take, until, spoiler alert, he can't get rid of Hyde anymore. He can't stay Jekyll. It becomes more and more difficult because it's arguably the right side of the brain getting more exercise and therefore taking more control. So one of the things that I think is also really interesting about the idea of double brain, but also Jekyll and Hyde, is the fact that Hyde, or the right side of the brain, is something that he's not supposed to let out. Right, something that he's societally is not accepted, and so he has to create Hyde to let himself be free with that. And nobody knows what that is, because Robert Louis Stevenson is very vague about what terrible things, quote unquote, it is that Hyde is doing. And there have been a lot of different interpretations about that. So like some people interpret it as like homosexuality, is that the side of Jekyll that he's trying to hide. Other people have said, no, it's not that. It's the kind of like violence, the violent side of him that he wants to let out. And there's potentially arguments to be made for both. It could be a combination. It could be none of those things. But so I think that is an interesting element of it, especially because the Gothic itself was a lot of the time seen as this kind of subversive form of literature, something that you might want to hide if you have that interest.
Yes. So are you thinking about Elizabeth Gaskell now?
Yeah, because I know you like Gaskell.
I do. It's almost distressing how often I bring her up, just constantly. Because there's that bit in Wives and Daughters with Claire, the confusingly named Claire.
Yeah.
The governess turned second wife of Mr. Gibson, so Molly's stepmother. And the fact that there's references to the fact that she has like these dirty, dog-eared copy of novels, and obviously as a governess, novels, and I mean I've just finished doing some reading with my corrections, and there are all of these texts from governesses basically explaining how unhealthy it is for your mind. It's really interesting how many of them refer to it as like sweeties and like delicacies. They're just like, if you feast on novels alone, then you just end up with this sweet tooth, and you can't like process like any wholesome food or wholesome like information or education, which is interesting. And actually quite a lot of libraries seem to have some distaste for women in those settings. So I think I told you there was one that basically, again, I don't understand this at all, but for some reason apparently men was flinging ink on the floor while they were, I don't know, writing letters, copying things down. But basically in one of these periodicals it was saying men were really annoyed by the presence of women because they could no longer put sawdust on the floor to kind of dry up the ink, because women were like, they're swishing skirts, it would get stained and dirtied otherwise. And one of them very specifically was like, women so slovenly, like they're constantly doing something while they're reading. So there were like criticisms of women getting their hair done while they were reading, or like cooking while they were reading, or like drinking. I know, drinking or eating. And I was reading this, I was just like, there are so many rules, because that I do like conduct. There's so many rules of being like, you should never eat and read at the same time. You certainly should not be reading before luncheon. And there were all these rules, and it seems like you'd have like 15 minutes in one evening to read. You're also not allowed to read in bed, because that was also what made women reading seem really lazy and things like that. So this is around... all of this stuff was coming around the time, sort of basically like from the 1840s, like 1880s, what I was reading. So Gaskell kind of like slap bang in the middle. So all of that stuff is probably impacting to a certain extent her character, Claire. So she doesn't think that she can read. And given the fact that some novels are supported by women writers and women activists of the period, they say, no, this is actually, some of them are really good, particularly... we see Anne Letitia Barbauld support Burney and Edgeworth and a variety of other women, because she says, no, they're educational, they show you the pitfalls, they show you the dangers, a bit like we were saying before with Gaskell's Ruth. It's usually seen as quite an unacceptable book at the time, because it has a woman who has sex and she has a child outside of wedlock, but it's used as a way to explain the dangers. Given the fact, though, that Claire is so... she feels like it's a sin. It's kind of a sin that she has this book. I would assume that it was not one of those novels of manners, or even not even maybe, well, knowing Claire as a social climber, it might have been a Silver Fork novel. It might have been sassy work. Okay. But also knowing Claire, probably Gothic.
Yeah. And I mean, even the fact that it's presented as this kind of like tatty dog-eared book, it's like, it's not pristine and pretty. It's this kind of like illicit thing that you're going to sneak into maybe your pocket, or
you don't even have a proper bookmark with it. You probably, I mean, that woman's constantly hiding like the tatty bits of her life, hidden under a pillow, this, that and the other, just sort of like constantly secreted away. And even because it's kind of sad, because it also sounds like almost a beloved object as well, like, because you sometimes like dog ear something because you want to go back to a certain passage, and even if it is from the sensationalist idea of Gothic of being like, oh, I want to feel this specific type of terror again, if we're going to go with like an Anne Radcliffe kind of vibe. It's sweet and sad almost for a woman or a character in literature that is really difficult to give any sympathy whatsoever.
Yeah, and it strikes me as really ironic that with the Gothic taking on that kind of role of, this is something that is, subversive, illicit, something that you might want to hide. And obviously The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a Gothic novel, and it's all about wanting to hide the more like subversive or the part of yourself that's not going to be socially acceptable. It does strike me as really ironic. I also feel like I can't help but bring up Northanger Abbey here, because whenever I think of attitudes towards the Gothic, I do think of Northanger Abbey, which I know we've talked about before as kind of slated a lot by various people, but we like it.
We like it. Fans. We're fans. We think it's great. Henry Tilney, bit condescending, but out of all the heroes, I think we'll go for him. I love Catherine. She's just living her life. I love it.
Yeah, I do as well. I mean, if we're thinking about the kind of attitudes towards the Gothic and this like potential danger of women reading the Gothic, that's got to be the best example, doesn't it? Northanger Abbey.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh.
Very kind of fun, tongue-in-cheek.
I do really enjoy it.
Yeah.
And because like a lot of the time, like Catherine isn't wrong. She's right for the wrong reasons, but she is right.
Yeah. So they should listen to Catherine. She had some good ideas from her Gothic novels.
Exactly. I mean, if you take it all as kind of like metaphor, but which like that kind of idea that like General Tilney is this kind of vampiric role, and he's kind of like sucked the life out of his wife, and kind of did.
Yeah.
Just not in a literal way.
Yeah. So that was our segue in defence of Northanger Abbey. Coming back to the double brain. So yeah, we get this like separation of this is the good side of you, essentially. This is the logic side of you. This is the more chaotic, emotional, potentially criminal side of you. And yeah, it becomes very literal in Jekyll and Hyde. And it also is obviously the kind of the same thing that we're talking about with Dream, where if you can't rationalize, if you can't keep those two sides together, essentially, if you let that slip, then that is insanity, that is out of control, and this is a real fear.
It does sound like a very stressful state to be in, thinking that at any moment, if you indulge too much in emotion, you will lose your mind and forever just be altered and be unable, because technically, if you've exercised the right side of your brain, so you're getting super emotive and you can no longer get rid of Mr. Hyde, then technically to reverse that, all you'd have to do is exercise the left side of your brain so it was stronger.
Yeah, but the Mr. Hyde wouldn't want to exercise the Jekyll side of him, and I think that's where it becomes like an untippable balance. It's only ever going to get worse with Mr. Hyde.
Okay, the reason I bring this up is because I saw several weeks ago the weirdest video I think I have ever seen. I think it was called Reason versus Logic, and it looks like it was created sort of vaguely, I want to say in the 1950s or 1960s, and it had this idea that like in your head there was reason and there was logic, and it's like a little caricature. Looks a bit like oh my god, why can I not remember this? You remember the film, the Disney movie? You've got 5 characters. It's like happy, sad, angry, disgust. Can't remember. Oh
what
my!
What is that called?
I don't know. It's completely flown out of my head. I can't remember. But that's
Inside Out.
Inside Out. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it was kind of like that, and I think that it's strange that it's permeated so far, because you had like, you know, reason was very straight-laced, and emotion was kind of like drawn as a caveman. And it was really strange because in those two conceptions, it had a man and a woman. Basically, the man, when emotion was, he's walking down the street and the man basically sees a woman and emotion takes literally the driver's seat. It's like characterized as a car. And he goes up and clearly whispers something very inappropriate to this woman.
Right.
And I was like, okay. And then when it goes to the woman's side of things, the one image that really stood out to me was her emotion taking control, was basically her eating a chocolate bar, and it kind of like gave you this silhouette of her ballooning out. And I was like, okay, so what we're taking from this is the worst thing a woman can do is gain weight, versus a man saying, unsolicited, inappropriate things to women on the street. I was like, this is an interesting insight into the right side, left brain, conception
right
in like the late 20th century, and our links there, and how we still see it as quite gendered as well.
Yeah, and actually you get that, pretty much exactly that in Victorian times as well. In periodicals, there are some like personified reason and logic, and how they kind of like, they go to sleep when you're dreaming, because reason and logic don't have much to do with that like chaotic transition of the dream state. So yeah, and also you just mentioned there, like emotion had the like caveman appearance, and actually again, if you think about Jekyll and Hyde, and the fact that, as we've talked about again on a previous episode, you had phrenology in the Victorian period, and the idea that actually if you were criminal or quote unquote evil, you would be able to see that physically. There would be a physiological kind of symptom to that. And so when people see Hyde, he is visibly different to Jekyll. So like his forehead's a different shape, and his facial features are different.
Fusion is like hunching over as well.
Yeah. So you do get an element of the kind of like monstrous to that, but you can definitely see that belief in the fact that you're like, what's going on in your brain is physically
affecting
visible on the outside as well.
I will tell you, when you were saying that it could be proven which side of your brain, and not that we like phrenology is not great, but the only thing that when you said you could prove it, I thought phrenology has to be the best way of doing that in terms of being non-invasive.
Yeah.
I was just like, God, I hope that they're just measuring people. I hope they're not
measuring your head. Yeah.
Anything
that would
else.
have been generally.
Oh, thank God. Honestly, I had nightmare fuel.
Were you thinking like
live
experimentation?
Hayley, these people were taking out pigeons' brains. I wouldn't put it past them.
Very true. But I mean, another good example of that idea of both the dual brain and the fact that you can physically see when you start to be like balanced one way or the other is in the picture of Dorian Gray. Because of course, when Dorian Gray wants to do bad things, wants to do like all of the things that he wants to do, we'll be coming to Dorian Gray hopefully in a future episode. So we won't go too much into that. But yeah, when he wants to do his like bad, quote unquote, bad things, the portrait is the thing that is affected by that physically. It is the thing that changes where he doesn't. So yeah, again, you've got that kind of attempt to separate the two things, and you know, it's not so different, although in a less kind of science fiction terrifying splitting of the self way, and more in a creepy kind of
real creepy
psychological gothic way, I think. Dorian Gray. But nevertheless, in either case, this, I think, really fascinating representation of kind of what people were doing with, or what people were thinking about with the function of the mind, the function of the brain, and kind of what makes us us, and how we can or cannot separate sides of ourselves that we might want to be or not want to be, and what might happen if we give in to things that we want to do, maybe aren't societally acceptable. And there was just a lot happening there, and there's a lot to dig into in terms of just Victorian society and how they thought about science, but also as kind of more in your field, manners.
Yes. And that idea that like you are only a couple of bad choices away from something really, really bad, and something really bad happening to you that's irrevocable.
Yeah.
Which, to some extent, seems like an unnecessary psychological pressure, being like, I can't even have this thought, otherwise I will slowly become this terrible person.
Yeah.
But on the other side of things, if we're looking at it from a manners perspective, it's like, kind of, yes, a bit like today, you are only I don't mean to be grim, but you are only a couple of bad things happening to you away from your life being very, very different.
Yeah.
So some of it seems like unnecessary stress, and some of
It
it does seem like
It's,
a realistic
fear.
reflection.
And again, going back to dream from our last episode, one of the fears associated with dream is if you can't control yourself, if you can't control your dream, then you might dream of things, or if you're a sleepwalker, for example, you might do things that reveal to other people the things that are secretly in your desires that you don't want other people to know. So same fear with the double brain. Fear for Jekyll, and why he creates Hyde. He can't have people see Jekyll as the person that desires these things.
And I wonder how many people who were caught having, for example, murdered somebody or another terrible act basically said, oh, I was asleep, going back to our previous episode.
Yeah, some people did. That's actually...
How do you prove that?
You couldn't, really. So, yeah. Again, complicated.
Maybe
not getting into it now, but yeah, people did try that. There's also kind of really old cases of... we maybe can get into this a different time, but really old cases of arguments that if you dream something, are you actually already doing something that's illegal? Because that is your inner secret desire to do that thing. So, for example, if you dreamt of killing someone, does that actually mean that you should be locked away because actually you desire to murder a person?
Okay, this has incredibly intense links to like the history of treason. I'm just being like, even having a conversation, even thinking, for example, about killing the king, technically would count as a punishable offence.
Yeah.
So there's that. But I have also been thinking about like criminal conversation, if you know what that is.
No.
Okay. Criminal conversation is essentially a woman engaging in adultery.
Yeah.
Because, again, it was kind of put in like a very pretty wrapped up kind of way of somebody saying, not without like essentially going up to someone and just being like, so-and-so slept with so-and-so. It's, no, this gentleman engaged with in a criminal conversation, sometimes known as crimcon, by those in the know, with a lady. And when charges are kind of like brought up, it's kind of treating the woman like she's property. So basically you have to pay property damage in that trial because you've damaged another man's property. Because, like, yeah,
that's interesting.
But it's kind of like all of those kind of distancing links are just being like a dream, a thought.
Yeah. Things that you can't control.
Yeah, or like a conversation, and how much does that like relate to action? Because in the past it has done quite intensely, like I say, with people being brought up on charges of treason or people being brought up on charges of criminal conversation. Because sometimes there's lots of evidence and sometimes there's almost no evidence. Because again, how do you prove a conversation took place?
Yeah. So on that disturbing note,
terrifying note, hate it.
On loss of reason and criminality
and people being seen as property.
Yeah, we leave you with that final spooky, creepy thought for the month, because the next time we see you, it will be Christmas.
There'll be nothing spooky or creepy aside from potentially dolls, because those are terrifying.
Or ghosts, because Victorian.
Oh, so my maybe. God. Oh, because, well, we are called all the year round, and Dickens, he did love a ghost story at Christmas.
He really did.
Yeah. And he liked getting everybody in his social circle to write a ghost story at Christmas as well.
Well, it's only right in Victorian times. But yeah, we'll see you for festive thoughts in December.
Bye for now.
Bye.